For 4 decades, if you spotted a UFO soaring over the Nevada desert, the likelihood was that you weren't witnessing extraterrestrial activity. What you were actually observing was the genius of Kelly Johnson at work. He created aircraft that soared beyond the reaches of the atmosphere and traveled faster than bullets fired from rifles. He constructed apparitions. He stands as the most clandestine engineer in the annals of American history. And this entire extraordinary journey began in a foul-smelling circus tent located adjacent to a plastics manufacturing facility. Clarence Kelly Johnson didn't enter the world with privilege or wealth. He was born to Swedish immigrant parents in an isolated mining community in Michigan. His background was one of poverty. He possessed remarkable toughness, and he demonstrated brilliant, almost arrogant intelligence. During his school years, other students targeted him with bullying because of his given name. He refused to accept this treatment passively. In fact, his resistance was so fierce and determined that his peers eventually gave him a new name, Kelly. This combative spirit didn't fade as he matured. Instead, he brought that same fighting attitude into the genteel, conservative world of aviation engineering, and he completely disrupted its established norms. In 1933, Johnson became part of the Lockheed Corporation. At that time, he was just 23 years old. The typical behavior expected of junior engineers was to remain silent, stay in the background, and perform menial tasks like getting coffee. Kelly operated by entirely different rules. During his very first assignment at the company, he examined the senior designer's prototype model for the Electra airliner and delivered a blunt assessment, declaring that the design was unstable and fundamentally flawed. The senior engineers reacted with shock and outrage. They questioned who this young upstart thought he was. However, they faced an uncomfortable reality. His assessment was accurate. Johnson took responsibility for correcting the design flaws. The Electra subsequently achieved legendary status in aviation history. At that moment, Lockheed came to a sudden realization that they had discovered an exceptionally talented and unpredictable individual. By the time 1937 arrived, global conflict was on the horizon. The U.S. Army issued a requirement for a fighter aircraft, but their needs went beyond just any ordinary fighter. Their specifications called for a high-altitude interceptor. The performance requirements bordered on the absurd. The military wanted an aircraft capable of flying at 360 miles per hour with exceptional climbing capabilities, like a rocket ascending skyward. Every competing company in the industry responded that such specifications couldn't be achieved using a single engine. Kelly's response was straightforward and decisive. If one engine wouldn't suffice, he would simply use two. His creation was the P-38 Lightning. This aircraft represented a radical departure from conventional design. Rather than featuring a traditional fuselage structure, it incorporated a central nacelle housing the pilot and weapon systems, along with two substantial booms that contained the engines and turbo superchargers. The visual appearance suggested two separate aircraft had been joined together. Critics dismissed it as aesthetically displeasing. They characterized it as a grotesque creation. However, when it became airborne, its performance was nothing short of spectacular. It became the first fighter aircraft to exceed 400 miles per hour. Its velocity was so extreme that it encountered a previously unknown and lethal aerodynamic phenomenon that no pilot had confronted before. This phenomenon was compressibility. As the aircraft accelerated toward the speed of sound, the surrounding air couldn't disperse quickly enough to accommodate the aircraft's movement. This created a shockwave formation. The flight controls would become completely unresponsive. The aircraft would enter an uncontrollable dive toward the Earth, resulting in the pilot's death. It represented a horrifying enigma. The sound barrier wasn't merely an obstacle to overcome. It had become a death trap. Kelly Johnson worked relentlessly on finding a solution. He engineered dive flaps, which were essentially simple metal strips designed to disrupt the formation of shockwaves. While other engineers in the industry were making educated guesses and theorizing, Johnson was performing precise calculations and rigorous analysis. He rescued the aircraft from this deadly flaw. And ultimately, the aircraft played a crucial role in winning the war. The P-38 was the specific aircraft that successfully intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto, who had been the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. An interesting detail: the entire mission was conducted in complete radio silence. By 1943, the P-38 had achieved dominance in the Pacific theater. However, in the European theater, a new and alarming threat had appeared. Intelligence agencies began receiving fragmented reports. The Germans had developed something revolutionary, an aircraft that operated without propellers. This was the Messerschmitt 262. The U.S. Army Air Forces responded with alarm and panic. They suddenly found themselves engaged in jet-powered aerial warfare while still relying on piston engine technology. They were essentially bringing inadequate weapons to a technologically advanced confrontation. This desperate situation prompted American military leadership to take action. The Air Force made contact with Lockheed. Their need was urgent. They required a jet fighter, and the timeline was extremely compressed. They arranged a meeting. During this meeting, they presented the challenge to Kelly Johnson, asking how long the development would require. Would it take 2 years? Perhaps 3 years? Kelly met their gaze without showing any uncertainty or hesitation. His response was that he would deliver a functional jet within 180 days. The conference room fell into stunned silence. A 180-day timeline seemed utterly impossible to achieve. Conventional wisdom held that designing just the landing gear alone required 180 days. However, Johnson attached a significant condition to his commitment. He stated that he could accomplish this feat, but only if granted complete autonomy. He demanded no bureaucratic oversight, no inspections, and no interference from outside parties. He insisted on personally selecting the team members. He would determine the working hours, and he made it absolutely clear that nobody, under any circumstances, would dictate how he managed his operation. The general accepted these terms. However, there was a complicating factor. Lockheed's facilities were fully occupied with bomber production. The factory had no available space to accommodate Kelly's classified project. This necessitated improvisation. Kelly secured a circus tent for rent. He located an aging machine shop situated next to a plastics factory that emitted terrible odors. The smell was almost intolerable. It consisted of a combination of burning plastic fumes and decomposing chemical compounds. At one point, one of the engineers donned a gas mask and made a humorous remark. When answering the telephone, he announced their location as Skunk Works. This was an allusion to a moonshine distillery featured in a widely read comic strip of that era. The name proved memorable and endured. The Skunk Works had officially come into existence. Johnson personally selected 23 engineers, choosing only the most exceptional talents available. He established firm guidelines and expectations. He formulated his 14 rules of management. The 12th rule specified that mutual trust must exist between the military client and the contractor. The 13th rule mandated that access by outsiders be strictly limited and controlled. He cultivated an organizational culture centered on velocity. The mantra was to work quickly, maintain discretion, and meet deadlines consistently. Time was of the essence and constantly working against them. They had no access to computers or electronic calculators, only slide rules and their own engineering intuition. The team maintained a grueling schedule of 10-hour workdays, 6 days per week. Kelly Johnson maintained a visible presence throughout the entire operation. He personally inspected rivets. He confronted suppliers with demands and complaints. He even performed basic tasks like sweeping the floor. After 130 days had elapsed, the engine finally arrived at their facility. It was an engine of British manufacture, the Goblin, provided by none other than the company founded by Frank Whittle. Indeed, historical events are interconnected in fascinating ways. On day 143, which was 37 days ahead of what had been considered an impossible schedule, the XP-80 Shooting Star reached completion. They transported it to a dry lakebed for testing. The intense desert sun blazed down upon the aircraft's fuselage. The test pilot climbed into the cockpit. The British-made engine roared to life with its characteristic sound. Kelly Johnson positioned himself alongside the runway, casually chewing on a cigar. He had staked his entire professional reputation on the outcome of this single moment. The aircraft successfully took flight. It represented America's first operational jet fighter. It possessed sleek aerodynamic lines. It demonstrated impressive speed, and remarkably, it had been constructed inside a tent by a group of unconventional engineers who deliberately disregarded every established rule and protocol. The Army's response was one of tremendous enthusiasm and satisfaction. They immediately placed orders for mass production of the aircraft. Kelly Johnson harbored a deep disdain for bureaucratic processes and procedures. One might wonder whether modern innovation suffers from excessive regulations and rules. However, from Kelly Johnson's perspective, the P-80 represented merely an initial achievement. The war reached its conclusion before these planes could participate in significant combat operations. The Nazi regime had been defeated. However, a new adversary was emerging from the eastern part of the world, the Soviet Union. And this new conflict, which became known as the Cold War, would not be waged with conventional weapons and military force. Instead, it would be fought through espionage, intelligence gathering, and closely guarded secrets. The government required surveillance capabilities from above. They needed an aircraft capable of flying at such extreme altitudes that Soviet radar systems would be unable to detect it. Kelly Johnson was on the verge of receiving the telephone call that would fundamentally transform aviation history forever. His next project would be the U-2 aircraft. However, this time, the engineering challenge wasn't focused on velocity or speed, but rather on achieving unprecedented altitude. And the individual piloting this aircraft wouldn't be a conventional military soldier, but rather a spy conducting covert operations. Kelly Johnson had already demonstrated his capability to construct a jet aircraft faster than any other engineer or organization in existence. However, the global political landscape was undergoing significant transformation. The Nazi threat had been eliminated, replaced by a silent, ominous adversary, the Soviet Union. America found itself operating without crucial intelligence. The Soviets had successfully tested an atomic bomb in 1949. Stalin's regime was developing missile systems. But American intelligence agencies had no knowledge of their locations and no reliable information about their quantities. President Eisenhower desperately needed intelligence-gathering capabilities inside Russian territory. However, sending a reconnaissance aircraft over Soviet airspace constituted an act of war under international law. The only exception would be if the aircraft operated at such extreme altitudes that Soviet forces couldn't intercept it. This is where the CIA entered the picture. Their requirements differed from conventional military needs. They weren't seeking a fighter aircraft. They wanted a platform for espionage. They approached the Air Force with a revolutionary concept: an aircraft capable of flying at 70,000 feet altitude. To provide proper context and perspective, contemporary commercial airliners typically cruise at 35,000 feet altitude. An altitude of 70,000 feet approaches the boundary of space itself. At such heights, the sky takes on a black appearance, and the curvature of the Earth becomes clearly visible to the human eye. At that extreme altitude, Soviet radar systems would face significant difficulties in tracking the aircraft, and their anti-aircraft missiles would simply exhaust their fuel supplies before reaching the target altitude. The Air Force responded that such specifications were physically impossible to achieve. The atmospheric density at such altitudes is far too thin to provide adequate aerodynamic support for wings. Consequently, the CIA contacted Kelly Johnson directly. Kelly didn't waste time on arguments or debates. He simply proceeded to redesign the entire aircraft concept. He took the fuselage structure from a fighter jet and attached enormous wings that resembled those of a glider. He designated this design as the CL-282. The CIA assigned it the designation U-2. However, a significant engineering challenge remained. To achieve that extreme altitude, the aircraft needed to be extraordinarily lightweight. Every single gram of weight became a critical consideration. Kelly approached this challenge with obsessive attention to detail. He eliminated the protective armor. He removed the ejection seat system entirely. He even eliminated the conventional landing gear. Instead, he designed pogo wheels, which served as stabilizers, that detached immediately after the aircraft became airborne. During landing procedures, the pilot was required to balance the entire aircraft on a single central bicycle-style wheel, performing what essentially resembled a circus balancing act. The design was inherently dangerous. It was structurally fragile. In essence, it was a flying camera system, constructed from materials as thin as tin foil. However, this raised a crucial question. Where does one conduct test flights of a classified aircraft that officially doesn't exist? Flying it at any public airport was clearly not an option. Kelly examined maps of the Nevada nuclear testing grounds. He discovered a dried salt flat known as Groom Lake. The location was extremely remote. The environment was harsh and inhospitable. These characteristics made it perfect for their purposes. He gave it the deceptive name Paradise Ranch, as a way to deceive workers into accepting assignments there. In contemporary times, this location is recognized by a different designation, Area 51. Kelly Johnson's contributions extended beyond merely constructing the aircraft. He was responsible for establishing the entire base facility. Area 51 has since become the most famous classified military installation in the entire world. One might speculate whether the government continues to conceal advanced technology at that location even today. In August 1955, the U-2 successfully completed its first flight. It ascended to 70,000 feet altitude. The pilots wore partial pressure suits because without adequate pressurization, their blood would literally boil if the cabin lost pressure. From that extraordinary height, they looked down upon the world below with a perspective that seemed almost divine. For a period of 4 years, the U-2 operated with complete invulnerability. It conducted flights over Soviet Union territory without any significant opposition. It captured photographic intelligence of bomber installations, missile silo locations, and submarine construction facilities. The Soviet military could detect the aircraft on their radar systems, but they possessed no effective means to stop it. Their MiG aircraft would experience aerodynamic stalls in their attempts to reach such altitudes. Their missiles would detonate miles beneath the target. Kelly Johnson had successfully created a phantom aircraft. However, technological advancement is relentless and never remains static. On May 1st, 1960, Pilot Francis Gary Powers was conducting a flight deep within Soviet airspace over Sverdlovsk, Russia. He maintained confidence in his safety. He believed himself to be beyond reach. However, the Russians had developed a new missile system, the SA-2 guideline, and their strategy wasn't to fire a single missile. They launched an entire barrage of them. A shockwave generated by a nearby explosion fractured the U-2's delicate, elongated wings. The aircraft broke apart in midair. Powers survived the incident. He ejected from the aircraft and was subsequently captured by Soviet forces. This represented a geopolitical disaster of enormous proportions. The United States had been caught in the act of espionage operations with irrefutable evidence. The supposedly invincible aircraft now lay in fragments displayed in Gorky Park. Kelly Johnson observed the news reports with a sense of horror and dismay. His creation hadn't experienced a design failure. The laws of physics had simply managed to catch up with his innovations. He came to the realization that altitude no longer provided adequate protection. If concealment at extreme heights was no longer viable, there remained only one alternative method of survival. The solution was to move faster than any weapon could travel. The CIA returned to the Skunk Works facility. They were experiencing genuine fear. They expressed their concern that the enemy could successfully target them at 70,000 feet altitude and asked what course of action should be taken. Kelly Johnson reclined in his chair. He had already been contemplating this problem. His response was that they needed to abandon the strategy of floating at high altitudes and instead begin sprinting across the sky. He put forward a proposal for an aircraft that would achieve Mach 3 velocities, which meant traveling 3 times faster than the speed of sound, exceeding the velocity of a bullet fired from a rifle. This would be an aircraft moving so rapidly that by the moment enemy radar systems managed to detect it, the aircraft would have already departed the area. However, at Mach 3 speeds, the friction generated by air resistance becomes so extreme that aluminum, which was the standard metal used in all conventional airplane construction, would literally melt like butter under the heat. The aircraft would require construction from an alternative material. This material would need to be extraordinarily scarce, extraordinarily difficult to work with, and extraordinarily costly. The answer was titanium. There was a single significant obstacle to overcome. The United States lacked sufficient titanium supplies. Would you like to know which nation possessed adequate quantities? The Soviet Union. In what stands as one of the most remarkable ironies of the entire Cold War period, the CIA established fictitious shell companies to covertly acquire titanium from Russia. The Soviets were unknowingly selling the exact metal that Kelly Johnson would utilize to construct the spy planes specifically engineered to penetrate their defenses. The project received the designation Ox Cart. The aircraft's appearance resembled a blade or dagger. Fuel would leak from the aircraft while it sat on the runway, because the metal panels were deliberately engineered to expand, only when subjected to high temperatures. This represented the most formidable engineering challenge in the history of aviation. The team had to invent completely new tools simply to cut and shape the metal. They had to develop a new formulation of fuel that wouldn't ignite or explode at temperatures of 400 degrees. Kelly Johnson was driving his team to their absolute limits of endurance. However, his accomplishment extended beyond merely constructing an aircraft. He was in the process of creating a legend. By 1964, the Skunk Works had successfully completed construction of the U-2's successor. The aircraft was positioned on the tarmac at Area 51. Its appearance suggested something from science fiction, like a spacecraft. However, there was an apparent problem. Fuel was leaking from the aircraft. To any observer lacking specialized knowledge, the situation appeared catastrophic. It seemed like a complete failure. However, from Kelly Johnson's perspective, everything was precisely as it should be. The explanation is that this aircraft was engineered to fly at such tremendous speeds, exceeding 2,000 miles per hour, that the friction generated by air resistance would heat the titanium skin to temperatures of 500 degrees Celsius. The metal structure would undergo thermal expansion. The panels would stretch and elongate. If he had constructed the aircraft with tight-fitting panels while on the ground, the thermal expansion during flight would cause the structure to tear itself apart in the air. Therefore, he deliberately built it with loose-fitting panels. The aircraft only achieves a proper seal when it reaches its extreme operating speeds. This was the SR-71 Blackbird. The pilots who operated this aircraft didn't wear standard flight jackets. They wore specialized spacesuits. Their flights took them to the boundary of space itself, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. At such velocities, the aircraft moves faster than the Earth's rotational speed. A pilot could observe the sun setting, execute a turn with the aircraft, and then observe the sun rising again from the western direction. This represented the ultimate paradox in engineering. An aircraft that appeared fragile and broken while stationary on the ground but became invincible once airborne in the sky. Kelly Johnson had resolved the missile interception problem through the application of fundamental physics principles. The standard operational procedure for an SR-71 pilot, upon detecting a surface-to-air missile, was remarkably straightforward. There were no complex evasive maneuvers required, no banking turns, no diving descents. The pilot's action was simply to advance the throttle control forward. The Blackbird would increase its velocity. The missile, traveling at its maximum possible speed, would attempt to intercept the aircraft, but the plane was moving so rapidly that the missile would eventually exhaust its fuel supply and fall back toward Earth. This remained the only aircraft in aviation history that possessed the capability to outrun a projectile in flight. However, the construction of this ultimate aircraft exacted a significant personal cost. Kelly Johnson managed the Skunk Works operation with an authoritarian management style. He became notorious for what was known as his nickel tour. If an engineer committed an error, Kelly would approach that individual, flip a nickel coin onto his desk, and instruct him to use it to call his wife and inform her that he had been terminated from employment. His management approach was harsh and unforgiving. He maintained extremely demanding standards, yet his team maintained deep loyalty and affection for him because he provided them with protection. When Air Force generals attempted to interfere with the design process, Kelly forcibly expelled them from the premises. When bureaucratic officials attempted to reduce the project budget, Kelly threatened to resign from his position. He constructed a protective barrier around his engineers that enabled them to accomplish seemingly impossible tasks. As the decade of the 1970s commenced, the world underwent another transformation. Radar technology was experiencing continuous improvement. Velocity alone was no longer sufficient defense. The Soviets were developing increasingly faster missile systems. Kelly recognized that the era of achieving superiority through speed and altitude was approaching its conclusion. The forthcoming era would be characterized by invisibility. Before his retirement, he established the foundational work for the next revolutionary development, stealth technology. He transferred leadership responsibility to his protege, Ben Rich. However, the fundamental characteristics of the Skunk Works, the culture of secrecy, the emphasis on speed, the attitude of confidence and determination, all of these elements originated entirely with Kelly. Kelly Johnson entered retirement in 1975. Throughout his career, he had designed 40 distinct aircraft. He had received every prestigious aviation award in existence. He had served as an advisor to multiple presidents. However, without the intense pressure, without the strict deadlines, without the distinctive smell of jet fuel and titanium permeating the air, his vitality diminished. He once made the statement, "I'll design an airplane for you, but I won't suffer fools." During his retirement years, he observed as the aviation industry became increasingly bloated, inefficient, slow-moving, and bureaucratic. It embodied everything he had despised throughout his career. The man who had constructed a functional jet aircraft in 143 days was forced to watch as new aircraft development projects required 20 years to complete. In 1990, the SR-71 was officially retired from service. During its final flight, the aircraft established one last record. It completed a flight from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in just 64 minutes. The pilots exited the cockpit and presented the flight log to the Smithsonian Museum. The ink on the pages was still wet from their entries. Kelly Johnson passed away during that same year. It seemed as though he and his greatest creation were connected by an invisible bond. When the aircraft ceased its operations in the sky, the master engineer ceased breathing. In the present day, if you visit the Smithsonian Institution, you can position yourself beneath the Blackbird. You can examine the titanium skin that developed ripples and distortions at Mach 3 speeds. You can observe the points where fuel leaked. The aircraft's appearance suggests something from science fiction. However, it wasn't constructed by extraterrestrial beings. It was built by an impoverished young man from Michigan who refused to acknowledge or accept the word impossible. Kelly Johnson's accomplishments extended far beyond simply building aircraft. He constructed the future itself, and he achieved this remarkable feat inside a tent structure, using a slide rule as his primary tool and operating under a simple promise: be quick in execution, be quiet in operation, and be punctual with deadlines.